This morning we've got Dr. Colleen Wessel-McCoy with us. I'll be doing the introduction. Colleen holds a PhD in Christian Social Ethics from Union Theological Seminary. She holds an MDiv from Union Theological Seminary, and she holds a BA in Religion and Social Justice from Agnes Scott College, which is a women's college.
It is, yeah.
And she is author of the text Freedom Church of the Poor, Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign, published by University of Cincinnati Press. Fortress.
Yeah.
Fortress Press.
Yeah.
And Colleen is the assistant professor of Peace and Social Justice Studies and director of the Masters of Peace and Social Transformation program at ESR, the program I graduated from. And it's just an honor to have you here with us today, and we're really excited for your program.
Thanks. It's an honor to be invited, and I met Jackson in very early 2020, and really grateful to be, get to know you and end up getting to cross paths in more ways than we realized we'd get to cross paths. So, including today. So this is really special to me. Really grateful to be here. Can y'all hear me okay?
Yep.
I'm getting over a cold, and you know how, well, for me, I always lose my voice after I feel better. And then everybody's like, oh my gosh, are you okay? And I was like, I was not 3 days ago. I am now fine, but my voice is not quite right. So welcome to everybody on Zoom. It's good to be with you across the distance. I am very excited about the travel that some of y'all are going to undertake to some of the civil rights cities, and it looks like the tour and what y'all put together is really pretty amazing. So I was asked to come and share some of what I know around those areas, and what the tour itself is so amazing. I was like, I don't know, I feel like that's the amazing part. So I was like, well, what if we talk about sort of the period that led up to those moments? And then a couple of Martin Luther King's reflections late in life about those moments, as a way of sort of putting some brackets around what those of y'all who are traveling will get to really experience in a deep and meaningful way. So I wanted to talk about a little bit of the long civil rights struggle and the long Black freedom struggle, and sort of how that sort of led to what took place in Birmingham, Montgomery, Selma, those cities in the South. So I'm going to slide my slides forward here.
Space bar.
Oh. So here's sort of starting back in the 1850s. I was really appreciating, as I drove in, seeing that y'all are going to be celebrating your 200th anniversary next year, and was just sort of thinking about where that sits on this chart, and that is a pretty significant piece of this history. But that's not my part of it. What I can sort of talk about is just acknowledging that the civil rights movement started in resistance to slavery, and that fight for civil rights and fight for freedom is, that you don't start the clock in the 40s or the 50s, but the clock starts in the 1800s. And sort of looking at the ways that people resisted enslavement as the origins of the Black freedom struggle, and that people resisted enslavement from the beginning. And sort of not forget that piece. So this motion and leadership of enslaved and free Blacks pushes the Civil War to settle the question of enslavement. That there is a counter-historical way that that war could have ended and left enslavement intact. And it was actually Black leadership and Black agitation among people who were enslaved. They wrote abolitionist texts. They emancipated themselves, like in their leveraging of the Underground Railroad. They abandoned the agricultural labor camps that they were bondage in, sometimes took up arms in taking part in the civil rights movement, but they provided that leadership that ensured that emancipation was part of how the Civil War unfolded. And so to recognize that leadership within it, that it wasn't just Lincoln, but that it was also Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and all of these leaders who, from the beginning, resisted enslavement. So as we're thinking about both that and thinking about the sort of why what happened in Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma happened, I want to look at the demographics in the South sort of as the Civil War kicks off, so in 1860. The black population was almost 4 million people enslaved. Most were working in cotton in that southern band of fertile land that was used for cotton. There were almost 500,000 people who were free, mostly in the North. Their life was also confined by white supremacy, but that they were free workers in the North. Of the people who held people in conditions of slavery, there were 385,000 individuals who held people in slavery. If you count that person's whole family, so that's the head of the household, if you count their whole family, it's 2 million people who held people in conditions of slavery. Of that, 25,000 people had very large agricultural labor camps, sometimes called plantations. I come from the South, I come from Georgia, and people still use this word plantation, and they usually mean something pretty bucolic and beautiful, so there'll be like retirement homes called Oak Acres Plantation and things like that. And so I've made a habit.
Have your wedding.
Have their wedding at a plantation house. So I've tried to get in the habit of being very clear that a plantation is an agricultural labor camp. And so I've tried to use that language just to remind myself that there's nothing beautiful about it. There's nothing bucolic, nothing pastoral about it, that it was brutal. But of those big agricultural farms, 25,000 people, like most enslaved people, lived in these big operations of very wealthy landholders. And then there were 5 million poor white farmers, sometimes called yeomen, the people who were not wealthy enough to enslave anyone, who sort of subsistence farming, maybe with a little bit of extra for trading. But so if you look at the demographics, there were a lot of those people. There were actually more poor white farmers than there were people held in slavery. And then definitely more poor white farmers than there were enslavers. There's other players here. If you really wanted to jump into it, you'd have to talk about like the northern industrialists who made money off of enslavement, even if they weren't in the South and didn't directly enslave anybody. But their wealth in part came from the cotton trade. And then northern white workers, what was their interest? They might see it differently, but in some ways, as long as the wage floor is 0, then their wages are suppressed. And then there's northern black workers, western farmers. So all of these pieces are trying to wrestle with these questions in that moment, and then it leads to the Civil War. And then just to say, people who kept people in conditions of forced enslavement, they called that capital. They talked about people as being capital, human capital. The value in 1860 was about $4 billion in that time, which today would be $7 to $9 trillion. Actually, that's probably changed. I haven't adjusted that inflation recently. So it would be even greater today. So in Reconstruction, so the period following the Civil War. They abolished the slave labor system. They had constitutional amendments, both the federal ones and the state ones. They had labor rights, voting rights for people that didn't own property. So it sort of expanded voting rights for the, both the free blacks and the poor, those 5 million poor white folks. Equal treatment under the law. This is where we get free public education. And then this legacy of black freedom struggles is rooted in the Reconstruction period. I want to show this image from the Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. One of the last rooms that you go through has this painting, this huge painting, and it's like, the actual painting is like the size of this wall. And you come in and it's just amazing to see. This is the Virginia General Assembly in 1887. And throughout the post-war years, sort of immediately after the war years, there were tons of black elected officials all across the country. I don't know that the link would work, but if you go to Wikipedia and there's a page of black elected officials in the post-war period, and you just scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll. And that's not how we think about, or at least it's not how I was taught to think about black leadership. And as people were, breaking racial barriers in my lifetime in the 80s and in 70s and 60s, it was coming up from zero, but it was actually, that zero was coming down from really there being a history of black elected officials. So that leadership, though, was defeated in the defeat of Reconstruction. And just to say one other thing is that list of accomplishments from the previous slide, these are the leaders who made those accomplishments, who participated in getting free education, getting the right to vote. In South Carolina, 46% of delegates to the Constitutional Convention were people who had been enslaved. So almost half of delegates to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention were free black people. Of the 53 white delegates, only half were taxpayers. So it means that half of the white delegates were people who were too poor to have paid taxes in the previous year. And that's who wrote the South Carolina Constitution. And that's not how we learn about that. So here's I'm not going to click it, but that's the link to the Reconstruction era black office holders on Wikipedia. So this black leadership and poor white leadership was not easy, but it was a fusion coalition. They thought of themselves as a fusion coalition. And this language of fusion was an important one. It was part of how they got that. Again, the public education, voting rights, some self-governance. That fusion was defeated. And part of what defeated it was this rise of what they call the redemption movement. And it's sometimes talked about as like the lost cause. And so here's figures here. This is Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. This painting is from 1869. And in that last room of the Civil Rights Museum, this similarly is a giant wall-sized painting. And the two paintings face each other. And sort of these are the two realities that came out of that post-war period. And this is this sort of, again, like beautiful, they're almost like religious figures, painted as heroes of a war they just lost, but painted as heroes. Jefferson Davis said, "The contest is not over, the strife is not ended, it is only entered upon a new and enlarged arena." And they meant that, and they acted on that. And they really went after that fusion populism that had also come out of the war. And part of how they did that was with violence. So the first Klan, here's the images from 1871. There were actually lots of different violent militias The Klan is the one we sort of know the most, but they specifically targeted the centers of black political life. So they knew that they could go after black life, black church, black political meetings, black Republican political meetings, and these were the paramilitary arms of the Democratic Party. So like red shirts in some areas, Klan in others. And so the Klan is the one we know the most about. The red shirts was also an important part of that violence that defeated the fusion of poor whites and poor blacks by using racism and white supremacy and targeting black leadership. So then they also used, out of that violence, was paired with legislation. And so this is the origins of the segregation that had to be defeated in the cities that y'all are going to visit in the civil rights movement in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so the thing that you might notice here is that free people with no lawful employment, free blacks with no lawful employment or business, and white people assembling with no lawful business, with black people on terms of equality, shall be deemed vagrants and shall be fined. And so there's a couple of interesting things here we can sort of break down. But part of it is that the black people being forced to work, right? So pushing people back into agricultural labor, and also blocking them gathering together. And so it is both, in the origins of segregation, is both about sending black people back to work on the cotton farms and about keeping those 5 million poor white people and the 4 million poor black people from congregating together and finding common cause. So this is 1866 in Mississippi. One thing to know is that agriculture continued and even grew after the war and after the abolition of enslavement. So this is cotton production. It dips during the war. They produced less cotton during the war, including because black agricultural workers refused to work, and because the war took the policing off the plantation, they could do work stoppages and work slowdowns. So part of that reduction is from a form of resistance among black enslaved people. But then it actually, after the war, takes off higher than pre-war levels. And so even though technically folks were emancipated and free, they were still harvesting millions of tons of cotton. And again, those 5 million poor whites and 3 or 4 million poor blacks were doing this labor, and actually had sometimes very similar working conditions of tenant farming and sharecropping. Those were the two models. And both models tied people to the land in a pretty brutal way and kept people really forced to continue doing that work. So they're technically free, but actually not able to just leave and find a different job. They were actually, so I've got an image here. So here's some of the poor white and poor black agricultural workers, and this is by 1930. This is an image of the migration, so people who could leave did leave in these waves of migrations northward. White folks did too, and that's actually part of my family's story. White folks that were doing sharecropping and tenant farming also moved north. Black folks were driven both by the pull of wages and the push of violence. So pushed forward by violence, escaping the violence of the South if they could. Both black and white, were soon replaced by automatic cotton pickers. And so as the automatic cotton pickers became more common, folks lost their jobs. And because so often their housing was tied to their employer, they lost their housing too. So there would be this crisis of people, the farm owner would invest in the machinery, and people would have to leave. So part of how we get to Montgomery, Birmingham, and Selma as urban centers of black life is that people had to leave the farms where they were more dissipated. And as people moved to the cities, as they were pushed off the land by the mechanization of cotton picking, people congregated and looked for jobs in the cities. And so part of what made the civil rights movement possible in the 40s and 50s is that people were not hidden apart on farms, but they were now living in the city because that farm work wasn't available. There's more to be said there, but I might jump to here. This is my hometown, Atlanta. You know, as you're visiting all of these great historic sites in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Selma, there are still historic sites celebrating the lost cause. That sort of other image from the end of the museum, that this was also created to celebrate this different telling of that history, the telling of there's a lot going on today around us, but sort of trying to claim a different reading of history. So that is also there in the South. Similar, this is a Confederate Memorial Confederate Memorial Chapel that is also held as a sort of memory of the Civil War, but sort of points to a different telling of that history. That's in Virginia. So I want to get to the King's speech at the end. I've just got a couple more slides, and then I want to open it up for conversation. But at the end of the march in Selma, King gave a speech that actually talked about the fusion politics of Reconstruction, poor whites and poor blacks coming together. And he talks about the defeat of that fusion. And here's what he says. So this is the end of the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March. This is what he said. I want you to follow me through here because this is very important to see the roots of racism and the denial of the right to vote. The threat of the free exercise of the ballot by the black and white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. They segregated Southern money from poor whites. They segregated Southern Moors from rich whites. They segregated Southern churches from Christianity. They segregated Southern minds from honest thinking. And they segregated black people from everything. So in this moment in Selma, he's pointing back to this long history of freedom struggles and the way in that moment it was defeated, but that poor whites and poor blacks had united around the things they have in common. Interested in voting rights, education, self-governance, and interest in sort of society not being as unequal as it was when the people wanted 40 acres and a mule. They were talking about the ability to be independent farmers in the ways that some of the yeomen had been, but then as the big planters bought up that land, it was less possible to be an independent farmer. That's actually what a lot of people wanted, black and white. And so King, 100 years later, is talking about that defeat of Reconstruction and trying to call people back to that possibility that had been before, and sort of reunite them with that earlier history. So a couple more things. So jumping to King's final staff speech. So this is the last time he gathered the staff of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. They were in Atlanta. This is 1968. And he's reflecting in this moment. So they had won the big landslide victories of civil rights, voting rights. They almost had housing rights. But he's reflecting on it, about where they go next. He says, now in any movement, you have to have a simple demand around which you galvanize forces. But that doesn't mean that's all you're going about. It doesn't mean that's all you're going to get out of it. In this case, we mentioned jobs or income. So they're talking in this moment about jobs or income. He said, remember Birmingham? We were talking about lunch counters. And we marched and went to jail and all of that. But as a result of that, we so subpoenaed the conscience of the nation to appear before the judgment of morality on the whole question of civil rights that we got a civil rights bill that had been Title 9. Oh, Dad. No, 9 of them dealt, it had 10 titles. 9 of them dealt with things that we weren't even talking about in Birmingham. Only 1 title dealt with what we were dealing with in Birmingham. The other 9 titles came as a result of our centering on that one simple single issue. Now we're saying, in this case, in 1968, jobs or income, because that's a simple issue around which you can rally more people than anything else at this time. And importantly, in 68, he was talking about poor whites, poor blacks, poor Latinas. He was imagining going back to this fusion organizing of the Reconstruction period, and that's where they could go next. And so he's both drawing lessons from Birmingham, but also talking about, like, how do we draw everybody into this movement? And then one last slide, and then we can talk about it. But so this is 1 year before that, and it's again a staff retreat, this time in Broadmoor, South Carolina. He says, I think it's necessary for us to realize we've moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. We can't solve our problems until there's a radical redistribution of economic and political power. Now, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power, then we see that for the last 12 years, we've been in a reform movement. We are seeking to reform certain conditions in the House for our nation, because the nation wasn't living up to the very rules of the House that it prescribed in the Constitution. Then, after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. And we must see the great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. Now we are called to raise some questions about the House itself. In short, we've moved into an era where we're called to raise certain basic questions about the whole society. So this is where King was in 1968. And part of what we were maybe I should end here, but I'm going to show you one more slide. So here's the electoral map in 1968. So Nixon won. It's actually, if you look at the actual popular vote, it is not as much of a landslide as it looks with, we're all familiar with this. So we've learned this. Wallace, the segregationist, carried all of those southern states, including calling the poor white vote. Wallace won in those states with his populist but segregationist. So did I have the numbers? Humphrey got 43% of the vote. Nixon won by 500,000 votes. His popular vote was only 500,000 above Humphrey. And George Wallace won over 13% of the popular vote. So, wish I had stopped the slide before, but so that was, King was assassinated in April. That was the election in November. And the, sort of where he was thinking in the year leading up to there is not unrelated to how that electoral map ended up. So, I wish I was traveling with you for those who are traveling, because there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to know. But I wonder if people have thoughts or reflections about any of this or related things. Yeah.
I have a question. You're talking about the number of enslavers, 365,000. Those were individuals. But what about institutions? Because as this week, just looking at this reconciliation going on with Jesuits, because they had slaves helping to build universities, and there are other places, there are other organizations that had slaves.
Yeah.
So do we have any idea about the number of institutions?
That's a really good question.
Had that?
And even just flagging it is important to flag that reality existed. John, do you have thoughts about John? Actually, this is my husband, John,
Hey,
and he actually is more of the historian of this period than I am.
so even in the time, that number, that 385,000, that was just like, that was quoted by political economists, by everyone across the board, right? And it'd be curious, part of what I wonder though is like, we recognize that there's a much farther reach, but actually that, I think, not to miss the significance, even if they're connected to institutions, like I think that number represented in the way that the ownership of property, right, like a person's name is on the deed, right, a title of a thing, and in the form of chattel slavery, where you are claiming to hold property in another human being, I think that still is a fairly accurate, like, which is remarkable, actually. Like, I think William Seward, right, who was, although he sort of let Reconstruction down later, was a radical Republican, in the 1850s would talk about this element of the enslavers as being a 1%, right, of their, you know, like they actually used the terminology of the 1% in the 1850s to refer to this section of property holders that were enslavers, right? So I think it's pretty remarkable. It's a small but powerful. I don't know. Maybe this is relatable to people now, right? In terms of the concentration of wealth and economic and political power. So, yeah, there's more people benefiting, but that number really does represent kind of like an incredible concentration. Plus that 25,000. Among that, even of those who are the enslavers, that 25,000 who have the majority, right? Like it's even like the 1% of the 1% maybe or something, right? Anyway, if you were to do an Occupy, we used to do this thing. If you were to do an Occupy of the most powerful economic, you know, section of the ruling class in this country, you would have gone to Natchez, Mississippi in the 1850s, because that was the highest concentration of like wealthy individuals in this country. You know.
So, one question I have, I know slavery was very common throughout, all the way up into New England. But it began fading away.
Yeah.
Is there a thought that fading away might have continued without the Civil War?
This is a good question, and particularly in the origins of like the Bill of Rights and sort of the 1776 and this sort of spirit of like freedom was at odds with the ideas of enslavement. And so like the Methodist Church, for example, has drawn up sort of an abolitionist, not an abolitionist stance, but an anti-slavery stance for the whole Methodist Church in this period, 1778 or something like that. But part of what happened is they discovered cotton, and they discovered how profitable cotton was. And so this is really the moment that they started to produce more cotton. So before that, the agricultural work had been in other crops. And so when they realized how much wealth there is to gain from cotton, they reversed course, including the Methodist Church reversed course and started to say, maybe this is okay. And so it's not just cotton, but part of what happened is that they started using enslaved labor in places where cotton grew, and it sort of expanded westward, and people weren't willing to give it up, if that makes sense. But it is a good, I do also like this counterfactual question of how do we abolish slavery without the devastation of the Civil War? And can we imagine what lessons we might learn from imagining that possibility? I don't know if that's a little bit behind what you're asking.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Is there a way of moving towards a change on that scale without war? And it is an important question, I think.
I was kind of amazed that the production of cotton increased after the slump
Yes.
and back up, so I kind of looked up cotton gin and cotton combine to find out if that had something to do with it. And I'm also thinking, I wonder how many of the 5 million poor whites and the 4 million slaves indentured themselves in order to provide the workforce. Was there any of that going on?
As indentured, particularly
I
like
mean,
the model of
that's with the
indenturing.
tenant and sharecropping.
Tenant and sharecropping, yeah,
Yeah.
yes,
It was the reality of surviving for their families.
yeah, yeah, and wanting to do something different, but getting drawn back in.
And there's so many aspects, actually, if anyone's ever been, engaged with like, or knows the history of like mining and the way that the company stores and the coal camps operated, the plantation system operated in a very similar way. Some used scrip instead of cash payment, and mostly it was debt. Folks were just, they never could get out from underneath the debt. And so in that sense, indenture, yeah, that was the nature of the economic system.
Well, the other thing that really, really concerns me is our huge dichotomy today in income and the way it's taxed. And it started after the Civil War. Abe Lincoln levied a 3% tax for people making under 600 and up to 10,000, and a 5% tax to 10,000 above. I wonder if it had been a little bit different in the United States if that tax had been 4% of all income and provided an equality of looking at each human being as providing an equal amount of tax and therefore equally human. And I think that's true today. I think we have very wealthy people or even semi-wealthy people making more money than they ever will use in their lifetime, and they don't pay tax on it.
Yep.
If our president can pay $700 tax per year, and I pay $700 tax a year, there's something very wrong with that. And it has to do with equality.
The well-known writer Ta-Nehisi Coates
Yeah.
wrote a very famous Atlantic article on reparations.
Yeah.
I wonder if you had any comment on that.
I do really appreciate learning from him, and I think he wrestles with some of this longer history in a way that I find really productive for today. I have seen some interesting models of reparations. I think thinking about this institutions question in particular, there's not University of Virginia, the Episcopal Seminary in Virginia took this reparations question really seriously with their endowment. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about their work with it is that they didn't just stop with enslavement. They actually considered the underpayment of their workers in the 1900s too. And so they talked about the ways that the segregation meant that they could underpay workers on their campus in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they actually had better luck tracking down ancestors from their employees in that period and offering them some of what they felt like they underpaid their ancestors for their work. They really struggled to track down I don't know that they held people in enslavement, but they benefited from enslaved labor. But they struggled to find people who they could tie back to that history. It sort of raises the question of, do you do it quite that precisely, or are you talking about something like broad plans that sort of benefit people in a wider way, and what is possible there? I'd be curious what he might say about what does this particular moment call for, and how do we find the right things to insist upon in this moment if reparations is not possible in this particular moment. And yes, I mean, there is this, you point to sort of the long legacy of this history and the way that people have been denied wealth and opportunity. And what do we do? How do we reconcile with that in a real way? How do we take seriously this history and what do we do about it?
I have another question. At the time, in 1967, a little earlier than that, when King got outspoken about Vietnam War, and I was struck by that 67 speech, was moving from civil rights to human rights. I know at the time that he got a lot of flack for that.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of discussion, would the civil rights movement have been further along had he not, he was viewed as shifting his focus.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested in your take on that.
So I love this question. So if you read this speech like a little bit longer on both, you're sort of anticipating what was on the other sides of each of these quotes, and that he was very insistent on tying together war, poverty, and racism,
Right.
and that these three things couldn't be undone if you didn't undo all three of them. And so part of his thinking on the jobs or income and the way he talks about it, like, we're asking for this one thing, but what really we want is like a whole bunch of things. Like this is one of 10 titles of the sort. So we asked for this one thing. But he felt like if you could get, that there would be like millions of poor white people who could get behind this jobs or income demand, and then poor blacks, actually both north and south, they could all get behind this jobs or income demand. And if the government agreed to it, they wouldn't be able to afford the Vietnam War. And so it's sort of his thinking is that if you could get people, you could sort of raise the point that the government would have to choose between paying for the war and paying for jobs or income demand. That even people who were in favor of the Vietnam War, which was fairly popular in '67, less so, sort of started to decline in '68, but that if you could get people to sort of have to choose between jobs and income and war, that they would go for jobs or income. And so it would be a way of like rallying people around race, poverty, and war. And that it would also, because it was a jobs or income demand, was for people of all races and ethnicities, that it would benefit poor black people in the same way that it would benefit poor white people, and sort of pull people into a greater equality. And so it's him saying jobs or income is no less in his mind about defeating white supremacy and peace and nonviolence. That all of that was this was his tactic for his sort of political assessment, that the way that you get to ending racism, poverty, and war is by getting everybody to sort of sign on to around the poverty issue. And you can sort of hear the lessons of Reconstruction in that. You can sort of hear this fusion politics saying we want free education, we want everybody able to vote, we want everybody to be able to have what they need to sustain themselves in terms of making a living. In the ways that the planners didn't like that for a reason. Yeah.
In terms of the Vietnam War and Quakers' stances on pacifism and stuff, I'm asking a very broad question, but how significant was Quakers' role in the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement?
It's both very significant broadly and in this moment when he was, who he called was American Friends Service. So when he made this statement here about let's get people that are together on jobs or income, he called American Friends Service and said, "Who do you know?"
Let me check.
And they actually lent him a staff person to work on this project. And some of the best archives from this moment are in, because folks took good notes.
87
when they went to the meetings.
0721 9107.
And then I get actually almost word for word notes of what happened in that meeting in the AFSC archives. It was quite, so yeah, it was a really important moment. And just as, I know we gotta go.
Ahita
There's a
simama
really
kuja hapo uone
interest-
kama
just as a
haita
total
simama.
side note, there's an interesting FBI
Itasimama
memo
mara moja.
that tried to use Quaker leadership in the Poor People's Campaign to undermine the work that they were doing. And so they wrote up a letter that was disseminated to friendly news
Jamhuri ikosa
sources. It
kusimama.
was
Hiyo
under,
ni uongo.
it wasn't exactly COINTELPRO, it was something like that. But the FBI said they said that the white people and the black people who are co-leading, at this point it was called the Poor People's Campaign, can't get along. There's like strife in the office. And so they tried to exacerbate what may very well have been conflict in the office. I've never been part of an organizing project that didn't have conflict, but sort of taking that conflict and sort of disseminating through popular news sources, at least intending to, the idea that white people and black people can't organize together, that the white people are going to try to take control. I didn't say it quite that way, but like that they just were going to fight, and this wasn't going to work. But it's a small part of that history, but I think it's a interesting one. That attempt to sow division, including on the part of political policing in the FBI. So
Probably need to
yeah,
stop.
I think we're out of time.
Sad but true.
Yeah.
Colleen,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes. Thank you for having me.